Hi, this is Tatiana Serafin, Senior Fellow with the Carnegie Council.
Hi, and I'm Nick Gvosdev, also a senior fellow at the Carnegie Council, and we're the co-hosts of the Doorstep.
Welcome to today's episode, our final one in 2020, and a special one where we look back at our last few episodes and make some predictions for 2021. And with us to help us today is Judah Grunstein, Editor-in-Chief of World Politics Review, to give his insights on what we can expect in U.S. foreign policy and how we can connect that to your everyday life. What does it mean for you as we take on a new Biden-Harris administration and where America will be? Thank you so much for joining us, Judah.
Thanks for having me.
I'd like to start out by talking about a report that just came out this week from the Carnegie Council called The Public Responds, Contributing to a New Narrative on the Future of U.S. Global Engagement. I think this report really ties in what we've been doing this fall, looking at where we are in the world and what America could do to re-engage in different regions and also in different topic areas such as the environment. So, Nick, can you talk to us about the report and some of the key findings?
Sure, thank you. I think that the key findings are that Americans don't want to be isolationists. They don't want to turn away from the world, but they are leery about a foreign policy which essentially requires the United States to be everywhere, to do everything. They want the United States to play a leadership role, but not necessarily, as President-elect Biden has suggested in the past, to be at the head of the table. There is a desire for greater cooperation and coordination and certainly trade among fellow democracies, particularly in areas of technology, of energy, of climate change. Some distrust about being overly dependent on China and concerns about how countries like China source and produce the goods that they may be buying, but also a desire not to move into open confrontation with China, but to try to work with China to deal with a number of the pressing global issues, starting with the pandemic and then moving ahead with climate change. And I think that this report also has something that ties in with, Judah, what you've been writing about, which is this search for a new social contract, as it were. That there's a sense from these reports we've been doing from Carnegie, the focus groups, and then the polling data, and then this third report, which just released this week, which is that engaged citizens, voters, have a sense that there is a disconnect, some disconnect between governments and their concerns, and they're looking for that reconnection. And knowing that you've been writing about this in World Politics Review and elsewhere, if maybe you could give some sense of your take on this search for a new social contract.
Sure. I just want to say everything you just outlined in terms of the results of the polling and the focus groups that you've all been running. It tracks perfectly with everything that I've seen from places like the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, I believe it is. Last year, I think the Center for American Progress also released polling. In general, and I think perhaps to the surprise of some of the people who work and focus on foreign policy, the American public is really pretty well informed, has a pretty sharp take on what America can and should do in the world, and has a smart take and their finger on the pulse in terms of how what America is doing in the world affects them and their day-to-day life. I think we've already seen with regard to the Biden administration and some of the picks. I'm thinking in particular of Jake Sullivan, the National Security Advisor, but also Tony Blinken. They've spoken a lot about a foreign policy for the middle class and the way in which American foreign policy has to translate into real gains and benefits for people in their daily lives. I do think that is a very clear response to the way in which Donald Trump leveraged foreign policy. There's this a conventional wisdom in the foreign policy community that foreign policy just doesn't play a role in American domestic politics. We're irrelevant in the months before the presidential election, and we always complain that there's no questions at the presidential debates about all the burning issues. But in a very real way, Donald Trump managed to leverage foreign policy as a domestic issue. And he did it by mobilizing patriotism, nationalism, and the paycheck and the day-to-day concerns of Americans. So I think that this emphasis by the Biden administration is a real response to that. And we'll see. We also see that Susan Rice has been named someone who's a long time foreign policy, national security hand, has been named to a domestic policy role in the Biden administration. So again, I think these conduits and channels and bridges between foreign policy and domestic policy will be clear under Biden. And I think that we can talk more about it over the course of the show, but I think that especially in the aftermath of the pandemic and to address some of the economic fallout, the role of government in the private sector is going to be radically increased. And that just is, again, going to feed in a positive feedback loop to the fact that what America does abroad is going to have to feed into the benefits that people see in their day-to-day lives.
I think that's so interesting you said that, and I'll name another person that he named, Catherine Tai, for U.S. Trade Representative, and she very succinctly said, I have to refer to the whole quote because I really think that this hits home to what we've been talking about. Quote, "I am very proud to be an advocate for American workers to stand up for the ingenuity and their innovation and for America's interests across the globe. I look forward to harnessing the power of our trade relationships to help communities lift themselves out of the current crisis." Directly, Judah, to what you're saying, here we have a senior person, a senior trade representative, so someone very much involved in foreign policy and very much involved in China, which happened to be one of our first topics as we started the Doorstep. China's effect and influence on the U.S. consumer and the U.S. worker has played a big role over the past few months, and I think will continue to be looked at, and is quite controversial, right? There are two points of view: China as a threat, or China as potential cooperative partner in trade, potentially in the environment. What are some of your thoughts, Nick and Judah, on China?
Should I jump in, Nick, or do you want to?
Oh, go right ahead, Judah. This is one reason why having you as our end-of-year guest is as the editor of World Politics Review is you have that holistic global vision to be able to help us help our listeners walk through these issues. So take it away.
Right on. Again, this is the $64,000 question. It's really become the central issue in terms of American foreign policy. And really global policy, the global geopolitical and international arena, because Europe is very much recalibrating its posture toward China as well. And I think that, again, we've seen a sea change in the way in which China is perceived, and that preceded Trump's election. I think there were expectations during the campaign in 2016 that Hillary Clinton, had she won the election, would also have toughened up America's posture toward China. So I think that in this case, Trump is both a symptom and cause. Again, in a positive feedback loop, his hostility to China, I think, definitely has affected Americans' perception of China. And pretty much across the board in all the polling I've seen, the perception of China has gotten more negative. But I think also that he wasn't the initial cause of that. I think that again, it seems to vary both within the China desk community and within the broader foreign policy community. In the China desk community, although it's not as far a divergence as they used to say, the China hawks and the panda huggers, there's still a part of the community that holds out the idea that China and the U.S. Can still cooperate on a broad range of topics, most notably climate change. And then there's a much more sobered part of the China watching community that kind of has a hangover from the let's all get along. China is going to liberalize as it gets more integrated into the global economy. They're kind of rubbing their eyes and saying, wait, this didn't happen. We really need to wake up to the fact that China has an agenda, a competitive agenda with the United States. There's some disagreement of whether China wants to replace the U.S., whether they want to replace the global governance system that the U.S. has led and helped build over the past 40, 50 years, whether they want to use that system to its own advantage and maybe change the emphasis and the norms so that that system doesn't focus so much on human rights, for instance, and what governments are doing within their countries. China definitely has a very thought out plan in terms of reaching out around the world with investment, infrastructure deals, providing money and loans that aren't attached to conditions like human rights and things like that. So a very, very formidable competitor. And in response, the question facing the policymaking community is, how do you address that? How do you compete in a way that plays to America's strengths? How do you do it in a way that that confronts China where it needs to be confronted, that pushes back when China overreaches in terms of unfair trade practices, in terms of retaliation against allies like Australia we've seen recently? How do you do it also in a way that leaves open the possibility of working together on areas where we need to? And most importantly, how do you do it in a way that minimizes the potential for escalation, misunderstanding, leading to conflict and leading to armed conflict? I think everyone agrees that it's not in either side's interest for anything to get to conflict. And there seems to be a consensus agreement that China is not looking for conflict. It's not ready for conflict, and it wouldn't risk doing anything that would start a conflict until it's absolutely sure that either the United States would not respond or would not be able to respond effectively. So I think that in general, that risk is not is necessarily as elevated as some people might think. But there's always the chance that a freedom of navigation operation in the South China Sea could lead to a collision or a confrontation, and then hotheads on both sides could get out of hand. So all of this goes into the real complexity of managing that relationship, which will be crucial and fundamental for how the global economy and global geopolitics develop over the next 20 to 50 years.
I think what's really interesting, and to bring it home, is that we have seen through our report, the Carnegie report, the individuals we polled said they were willing to pay a little bit extra to know where their products were sourced and if they were sourced from democratic communities. And yet, there's that piece of data, and there's the other piece of data that more people are buying more on Amazon from China, Chinese-made products, than ever before during the pandemic. So there's this kind of divergence in what people are hoping for and what people have actually been doing over the past couple of months. And I think this might be also reflecting problems at the top in how to deal with China that you've addressed. Would you agree with that?
Absolutely. I mean, there has been, I think those traumatic first weeks of the pandemic really underscored for everyone that in general, accessing cheap products from China is fine. It has some economic impact on various sectors of the economy that have to be accounted for more effectively than they were previously, and that I think led to Donald Trump's rise. But suddenly with the pandemic, we had this moment where we were shocked to find that we were in a huge crisis, and the items that we need, we've become totally dependent on China for. Things as banal as disposable face masks. So all the time in the past decade that we've been reading about the danger of high-tech supply chains and the risk of backdoors in computer chips that might lead to vulnerabilities in U.S. national security. And all of a sudden, it's these like 2x4 pieces of fabric that we toss out after we use them that we can't get our hands on because China has it cornered, has that part of the market cornered. But how do you respond to that? Disposable is cheap. Bringing it back home means paying domestic wages. It means meeting regulatory hurdles, not necessarily on the quality of the mask, but maybe on pollution of the factory that's producing them. All sorts of things that raise the costs that make it much harder. I think that there will be a balance struck between, for instance, maybe joint stockpiles between democratic countries for certain strategic products. Maybe some sort of, again, a joint effort among Western democracies or Western and Asian democracies to have certain subsidies and industrial policies that allow domestic producers to meet those national security needs without raising the cost on consumers. But yeah, cheap products they're hard to wean ourselves off of. We've all gotten into the habit. 2 clicks and it's on its way and it gets here quickly. So that sort of effort is a cultural effort. It's a social effort. It's a question of changing our behaviors and changing our expectations. We've done that in the past. It's taken things like the massive economic shocks, wars, famines, things like that. Whether what we've all gone through in the last year will be enough, I'm not so sure. I'm actually not so sure. And I wonder how long the memory of the traumas of the pandemic will actually last. I think the economic impact will last much longer. I'm not sure how much some of the things we've learned, and to my mind, the proof, and I'll wrap it up, is that when we hit this second wave 2-3 weeks ago here in the UK where I am, but I think I read it in the US as well, the first product that disappeared off the shelves of the supermarkets was toilet paper. Once again, when everyone knew that it was unnecessary and that we were all going to have plenty to go around. I think our memories will be shorter in terms of the traumas from the pandemic, and that might make it even harder to deal with these questions of supply chains and strategic supply chains in products that have an impact on national security.
So interesting that you say that. I'm like, wow, toilet paper as a national security issue.
Well, no, I mean mainly that the memory was so short.
Yeah.
I expected that at least one thing would be different this during the second wave. No one would panic about toilet paper, but they did. Memories are short, and I think that come this time next year, should things go well with the vaccine and life is back to normal, I expect that movie theaters will be filled, restaurants will be filled. There will be a real economic comeback, and I don't think people will be taking the steps that you need to take in terms of inconvenience to source products from somewhere other than China.
Yeah. Well, I think it's a great point that you've raised about the short-term memory. How quickly we forget or we panic about something and we want a big policy change, and then a few months later, it falls by the wayside. And I think just some of the things that you've just said right now, I think are going to be interesting tests for the Biden and Harris administration, because everything that you've laid out in this past answer all requires trade-offs. It requires managing political trade-offs between different constituencies and interest groups, and you need to have a process for that. I know that we retweeted on the Doorstep podcast Twitter account, your observation about Vietnam, that the China hawks and the strategic community has always looked at Vietnam as this great, we need them as a partner against China, and yet domestic economic producers in the U.S. look at Vietnam and say, Vietnam's a competitor. They're not a friend. They undercut us in a variety of areas, from catfish to, clothing. And so, yeah, how you're going to reconcile all of these things of work with China here, but compete with them there. We don't want to buy certain goods from China, But then who's going to, as you said, I mean, as you laid out so eloquently, the point then of, well, who's going to make it, under what standards, what wages, what price are you willing to pay for, disposable masks and so on and so forth. And just my reservations are is looking at how the Biden administration is moving forward, and also with the uncertainties of how the Congress is going to shape out, is I don't know that there's going to be an ability to be able to have kind of that, far-reaching, far-seeing approach. Like, as you said, industrial policy is something that has to be done, coordinated with the other uh, U.S. Allies in Europe and in Asia. And that's something that will take a lot of political capital, which the administration may not have.
I'd add the Vietnam example is a great one, because you throw on top of that the democracy concerns, and that has been at least rhetorically a central focus of the Biden campaign. This need to really rehabilitate America's advocacy for human rights. And Vietnam has been a clear example where strategic interests are balanced against values and ideals, and not always to the great honor of the United States, but that's an aspect of trade, statescraft that we're familiar with. I think this question of trade-off is going to be central in terms of when we talk about a new social contract. The pandemic underscored, and we're all aware of it, the degree to which the social inequalities, the pre-existing social inequalities, were exacerbated by the pandemic, and the way in which the full brunt of the pandemic, which, let's remember, in the beginning, in the early days of the pandemic, the people who first had the disease were global travelers, business people, elites, politicians, people going from Asia to French ski resorts and then back to the UK. That was the early days of the pandemic, because that's who travels. That's who it has the kind of mobility and to be exposed to it. But later on, we saw the full brunt of the pandemic really hit frontline workers, essential workers, where poor people, minorities, women are concentrated in terms of jobs and exposure. And so I think that when you talk about trade-offs are a hard political sell. No politician wants to be in the position of saying, listen, we've all got to tighten our belts. We've all got to roll up our sleeves. We've got to do without. I don't think any American president wants to campaign on a platform of let's do without. So what does that mean? I think that the trade-off in terms of the American social contract, and also in the wealthy economies, but also the developing economies, it means that the elites and corporations are going to have to contribute more in terms of taxes, in terms of the social services and the social safety net that will get our societies through. There's no other, I don't see any other viable political sell. And that means through the government and a bigger government role. So again, this question of trade-offs on foreign policy, trade-offs on domestic policy, who is going to pay the cost? And I think that is going to be a real point of contention, because no one likes to give up privilege. No one wants to pay higher taxes. And so I think that's going to be a real point of contention in the next year, 2 years, especially once the lockdowns and other social distancing measures are relaxed. We've already seen a lot of social protest movements in spite of those health measures. I think that once things get back to normal might be a little more social protest and social contestation as the normal.
I think that's so interesting what you said, and a report just came out from Forbes yesterday that the world's billionaires, all 2,200 so of them, are $1.9 trillion richer over the past year. So to your point, I think that there is this opportunity for some help from these elites in particular. Mackenzie Scott, Jeff Bezos's ex-wife, gave away over the last couple of months, if you saw that report, $4.2 billion to areas of need, including social services that you mentioned. And one that I want to talk about is food banks, because this idea of food insecurity and this divergence that has been caused by the pandemic, where you are in the UK, I recently read about UNICEF actually providing food over the Christmas holiday to some people, the first time in 70 years that UNICEF has been engaged in the UK. And I wonder if not only should we be leaning on elites, but we should also try to re-engage with international institutions like UNICEF in 2021 and beyond, to try to meet some of the needs that have been exposed during the pandemic.
I think that what's fascinating to me is we just ran a feature in-depth article by Daniel McDowell, who's at Syracuse University, on the financial response by governments and central banks to the pandemic. And what was fascinating to me is that on an aggregate level, the impact of the pandemic has been a lot less than people worried. In the developed economies, especially between furlough schemes in Europe and the CARES Act in the US, a lot of the initial pain was mitigated. Aggregate savings has not been depleted. It might even have gone up. Credit card debt has not gone up. So when you pull everything together, the picture of the economic impact looks not that bad. There's been an increase in savings, which means there might be an immediate boost in demand when people can go shopping again, things like that. But then when you look at in a more granular way to the day-to-day stories that we're reading about, the impact and the misery is heartrending. And you have people going to food banks that never did. Record lines of people for drive-through food banks stretching miles and miles down the highway in the American South, I've seen. And so what we do about that, I don't know. To me, it's remarkable. I hadn't seen that about UNICEF delivering food in the UK. There's already, we see a certain injustice globally in terms of the distribution of the vaccines, which are going predominantly to wealthy developed economies rather than developing economies in the global South. The impact there economically is much greater. The governments have less resources to go around. A lot of the economies there are in the informal economy, so they don't respond very well to furlough schemes, things like that. I really don't know. I think that one of the huge vacuums over the past 9 months has been any kind of coordinated multilateral response to the pandemic, whether financial, humanitarian, or healthcare, global health governance. And I think that we're with the Biden administration, we're going to see a much more active United States try to organize and lead something like that. And I think that will have to include things like debt forgiveness for developing economies and humanitarian aid in the form of vaccines, but also where necessary, just food and direct financial aid to governments to help their populations. I don't see any other way around it. Because of the degree of the economic fallout.
One of the other areas where I think we also have to have global cooperation, that's big in our report and everybody talks about, is climate change. What do you see coming up in 2021? Have you seen a movement to create new conventions or new discussion points on this? We read a little bit that China was trying to take the lead as the U.S. Pulled back. Is there an opportunity with John Kerry now as this climate czar for us to kind of get back into the game?
I think definitely the U.S. will be more active and more present. I think one of the more reassuring developments over the last 4 years is the counterfactual to the idea that the world depends on American leadership to get anything done. The US pulled out of the Paris Agreement, and it had essentially zero impact on the rest of the world, with maybe the exception of Brazil. Perhaps there wasn't as much ambition in terms of advancing the goals that had been set out in 2015, There certainly was some disruption to the summit meeting systems, in part due to the pandemic as well. But for the most part, the world kind of shrugged off America's absence and continued to move ahead. They announcing pretty ambitious goals, whether China, the EU, Japan. There really hasn't been a drop off in terms of the rest of the world. So that can only bode well now that the U.S. is going to be back in the game and will be a more active participant. Um, we've all read and seen, it's the new buzzword, build back better, the Green New Deals and things like that. I do think there's a huge opportunity. The big oil was already on the ropes before the pandemic. The hit to demand has really made it clear that the energy sector has to get into the 21st century. There's certainly going to be a demand will definitely bounce back once economic production comes back. But again, the time horizon for big oil is in 20 to 30 years, trying to have something viable in terms of renewables and green. I think once if there's an opportunity after the pandemic, and it coincides well for Biden in terms of him taking office, is that it's easier to redirect the kind of capital investment that's needed when there's been this kind of disruption. And we're really at a point where renewables are beginning to become competitive. They're beginning to come online in the kind of scale where they can make a difference. And so we'll see. I think that really should be an emphasis, particularly in the developing world. One of the big themes of the climate change diplomacy is how do we use our experience from the mistakes that we've made over 200 years in developing Western economies to try to guide developing economies along a more sustainable path, because they're building from scratch in a lot of ways. So hopefully that will become a real mainstream part of the conversation. I mean, we've seen it over the last 9 months. Hopefully that won't be an area where there's that short memory, Nick, that we talked about earlier, and maybe hopefully there will be a more long-term memory.
Well, and what you were just saying right now reminds me of some themes that Ambassador Ray discussed in the previous episode of the Doorstep, when he was talking about opportunities with Africa. That with a number of African countries, you have this kind of ground floor effort where you can go in and invest and work, that they can leapfrog certain stages and move ahead. And he saw this certainly as a zone of opportunity for the United States. Tatiana, I know you had some more issues we wanted to get to.
Let me just
Sorry.
add one last thing.
Please, yeah.
This is an area too where the United States can learn from other countries. We just ran a piece recently on Uruguay's renewable energy sector and what they've done and how they've done it. It's a pretty impressive record that they've accomplished there. So again, coming back into the game can also mean learning from and figuring out what other people are doing right and how we can learn from that. So I think that a certain amount of humility as well is in order for the United States.
I think as 2021 comes into play and we're looking ahead, hopefully we'll see more cooperation versus isolation. I think that's the theme of this conversation for me today. In our few moments, I do want to talk about if we could each talk about what is going to be the big aha in 2021. For you, Judah, for you, Nick, I'm going to start. I'm going to say my big one is going to be, and I believe this, and I've said it throughout this fall, is that Gen Z is really going to take more of an active role based on what they learned in the social protest movements, not just in the U.S., but all, around the world. Gen Z has been leading the social justice movements, protests across the board. And I do think that global connections are going to continue to be made. Despite antitrust efforts against Facebook and Google, they're going to be around. They're going to continue to link people. And as you said, Judah, as we come out of the pandemic, I think we're going to go back to where we were before, if not even further, because we've all been communicating online. There's been, as we talk about, this borderless internet. You're in the UK, I couldn't tell. Nobody can tell where you are. We're talking, we're having conversation. I think Gen Z is going to propel the foreign policy conversation, the doorstep conversation next year in a more engaged way than we've seen before. That is my 2021 prediction. What about you?
I agree 100% with that. And well, no, not 100%, 90%. Because when you were talking about the younger generation and Gen Z, the first thing I thought is that they're the digital natives, right? Where I might diverge from you is that for me, I think the coming year and this whole period, I think what we'll look back on, perhaps even more than the pandemic, is the aha moment that tech is the genie that got out of the bottle, and what are we going to do about it? I'm not at all confident that 10 years from now, even 5 years from now, we'll have a borderless internet. People are talking a lot about a splinter net, where you'll have a China-sourced, China-based system and a Western or a democratic-based system. Countries like Russia have their own, are putting up their own great firewalls. So I'm not as optimistic for a global internet. And I believe that the coming 5 years will really, historically, when we look back on it, be defined by the battle between government and big tech and society and big tech in terms of antitrust, regulation, democracy, misinformation, privacy, data privacy. I think that those key issues will be the battleground that will determine a number of trajectories for human society around the planet. And I'm not confident about a global internet. I'm not sure that the big tech companies, Facebook, Twitter, Amazon, will necessarily survive in the form that we know them. I'm not 100% sure of that. I think that there's a huge gathering pressure to rein in the power that they have over our lives, because the more people learn, the more alarming it gets. That's my 2021 prediction.
And Nick?
So, well, just briefly, I want to piggyback off of two things that both of you said to inform my predictions for the future. And the first, Tatiana, from yours, is I do think 2021 is going to be the start of major political transitions, primarily generational. Um, there may be older generations hanging on. Say, I would assume Speaker Pelosi will be reelected, for instance, come January. But there's a point at which younger generations are poised to move in, and that's significant because, Judah, as you said, digital natives, generations that have grown up post Cold War with no memories, their views of the world aren't framed by that. And I think to see that Germany, when the transition happens there, we could be looking at the beginnings of a transition in Russia if some of these concerns about Putin's health turn out to be correct, that he may not be able to stay in power till 2036, as some people have assumed. So I guess that's the first. And then the second one, Judah, but this is a more pessimistic one, and coming off of your earlier comments, is the possibility that we could have an unintended clash in 2021. My worries are that as the Biden-Harris team gets settled, as they start to be more activist in the world, they're running up against other powers that have gotten used to America being pulled back. And it's that no one is looking for conflict, but it is that risk of the unintended conflict. We had that 20 years ago in 2001 with the EP3 incident between the U.S. and China. If that were to replay today with the change in relative power between the U.S. and China, it may not be it wouldn't be resolved in that same peaceful way. Perhaps it was resolved in April of 2001. So I guess my worry prediction for 2021 is the unintended crisis breaking out.
Well, thank you so much for your time today, Judah. This was a really fun conversation, and I look forward to 2021 and having you back for our 2022 conversation.
But yeah, hopefully I'll have gotten one or two things right. Thank you so much. It was a great pleasure.
Thank you very much. And thanks to all our listeners. We wish you all the best in the coming new year, and we'll be back in January.